essaye. Bon. Bon. Alors, je vous rappelle que
As a reminder, this afternoon, it's the architect's afternoon. So, given this way to think about garden cities, I suddenly thought, because I had prepared a little text already that was ethical and moral and something, and then I thought all of a sudden of Howard, who in 1913, when there was a publication by Purdom on where do we stand for garden cities, I remind you that he wrote his text in 1898, that he was republished under another title in 1902, and there was a commitment with there was another one that was found in 19. This is 10 years later, and the event, the concrete event, the beginning of projection of the construction of garden cities. And in fact, somebody asked a question to Howard, and he says to him, "But are you not disappointed to be only having reached this point with garden cities, which isn't even finished?" He himself looked at him, and he was quite a funny guy. And he said, "No, not at all. I'm quite happy. And in fact, it's true that the city isn't finished, but I'm already living there. And I go to London every day. I take the train every day. And I come home every evenings to sleep there. So I'm quite happy, and I think it's wonderful." So in fact, it's the idea of time. You hope that things are going to happen and you want it to happen right away, but in fact, it doesn't necessarily happen right away. But for people who are in it, they're in the time of it being done. And they don't measure time in the same way. Their experience is not the same. So Howard is continuing. So he says, "I hadn't imagined that my ideas could actually become such a reality in so little time. I thought that I would never know, I would never see this reality during my lifetime." So now I encourage you all to keep on keeping on, keep doing what you're doing and dreaming, and just continue. And I hope that we will see each other again. Our last half day of proceedings is under a title, Cities of Tomorrow. It's always difficult to choose the last theme of the last half day of such a colloquium. And there are many aspects having to do with garden cities could be dealt with. We could have stayed together for 3 or 4 weeks or 5 weeks. And I don't know if we would have made it with the heat, but we could have just stopped with detractors and adversaries. That's interesting as well. We could have made an incursion in other disciplines, for example, literature, which sometimes used garden cities as a topic. The Boys of Garden Cities, which was published in 1921, that opened up to another imaginary world. We could have continued, looking at Noémie, obviously, this infinite quest to not forget these unknown garden cities, this little treasure that still remains to be discovered. No, we chose the garden cities of tomorrow. Indeed, the vocabulary is always present in what we're saying in city and landscapers and architects. And for us, and this has been extant since 2010 in Great Britain, maybe a bit less in France in the spotlight. But this present is kind of shows that it's a source of inspiration still. But this brings about a whole series of questions. How is this term understood today? How is it used and perceived by various stakeholders? And what is studying the location, the exemplary locations that we have seen here in the last day and a half? Are these reservoirs of references with a potential for future projects? Can they be references to our thought in projecting the future? What are the values that gives rise to, and which ones have been forgotten or swept under the rug or added to Howard's model? And all of these garden cities in these places that were stratified. What are the ways of these being interpreted today or reinterpreted, these urban sectors? What might be the means, what might be garden cities in this century? Contemporary, ecosystemic, eco-responsible, operational, when faced with new paradigms, societal issues and environmental issues, with which burning climatic issues as well that we're faced with. So we intervene, and now there's one point in common. We're all convinced by the existence of the power of garden cities, and this reminds us of the power of words. And I think you always have to remember what words evoke in their ability to generate imaginary and to intervene directly in actual facts, in reality, that they contribute to building. And in our case, garden cities are a case in point. It's a word, an image, a polysemic word. It's a malleable word of many uses that defines a variety of objects. It's a magic word as well, which mobilizes whole repertories of rhetoric and space, and which comprises a true potential to project the future and to tell a story, which is very important in the urban fabric. And they are also concretely effective in mobilization. There's also a level of a demand. And so garden cities, without wanting to deflower what is going to be said on the stage here, these come from a triple conjunction: the force of a model, which is totally ecosystemic, the power of a word, garden cities, which has stratified, which has enriched over time and over 100 years of usage, and also the source of so many types of experimentations that took place throughout the world, ultimately, in the doors of Europe. But we stopped at the doors of Europe, but we could have gone to Australia or whatever. So these garden cities are anything but dusty old traditions. On the contrary, these are a fertile land for discussion and exchanges, to think about how we want to live, to think about a new relationship with nature, a new relationship with farming, relations between human and human, and saving resources and mobility and so forth. But let's start being a bit more, let's disagree a little bit to get things moving. Are garden cities not being instrumentalized with a view to just a purely commercial real estate development, which transform the utopia of garden cities into something that resembles an empty shell? Are not garden cities, can they still be a source of inspiration without being losing its soul in this neoliberal context and the increasing real estate pressure of and inequality when faced with the access to health and housing and culture? So this gives rise to increasingly to questions and the possibilities of doing this, of garden cities, and what is the role of the public and private actors and financing. This also gives rise to questions of ownership of the land and of the building. And it also queries, as we will see with our first speaker, the whole question of time. Garden cities need time to appear. So garden cities can be an alternative, a third way, as it were, perhaps, at least, a step aside from the dominant model of manufacturing a city, and even a new form of rurality, as we saw this morning, reinventing what rural is. So there are questions that have arisen, and hopefully we will be talking about these up in a moment. But the value of garden cities is that they place something new in our exchanges, architectural projects and urban projects and societal issues that are so important, and in our choices with respect to these projects of society. I just wanted to conclude, to loop the loop with Jeanette, to finish with a thought from Henri Sellier, who hammered this home. He said that the garden cities were urban experiments. They were societal experiences in a spirit of solidarity, cohesion, and participation. Hopefully the discussion will be fruitful and lively, and will carry meaning and be constructive. We are so fortunate to have with us this afternoon very different speakers. There are architects, promoters, researchers, practitioners. Obviously, all of these categories are completely permeable. And we're going to start with Paul Roberts and Isabel Taylor. Paul Roberts is a director of Turnberry Consulting in London. And he's going to speak to us about building garden cities in the 21st century in Scotland. He directly participated in that. Chapelton and Tunnegran, and the floor is yours, sir.
It is quite common to be introduced in a foreign language and hoping that it sounds okay. You don't know. I have to reach over here. I have to leave you at the end of this because I have to go to my daughter's 21st birthday party, and the last thing she said to me when I left was, "Whatever you do, don't miss your train." So whilst this is an important conference and you're important people, and it's really, really important, there are priorities. So my name is Paul Roberts, Turnberry Consulting. I'm speaking to you today as somebody who actually tries to build garden cities or similar things of that nature. That's my role, that's my job, and I'm going to show you two examples today. I've probably been trying to do this for about 20 years in this specific area. I'm a planner and a sort of real estate person by background. And I've been on this journey for a long time. There we are, the first thing I've pressed and nothing has happened. There we are, hold on a second. This is very, hold on. I've only got two hands. I'm thinking about working on three. No, I haven't touched it. There we are. Does this work now? That work now? Okay. Oh, I have to do that. Just click it. Anyway, or on there. Okay, thank you. Okay, this could make life more difficult. So, the surprising thing about these circumstances is I have a slightly unusual background to this, in that I live in Welwyn Garden City. I live in a garden city. And I live in the house built by Louis de Soissons the master plan of Welwyn Garden City. That was not an aspiration and a life choice. It just so happens that I do. And this has been 20 years of me thinking about how we build things in garden cities, and it's remarkable coming to an event like this to note that, when I was listening to ideas from Belgium, from France, from Germany, from Poland, the two garden cities, the first and second garden city company, Letchworth and Welwyn Garden City, still remain almost unparalleled in my experience. And everything that I'm trying to do, I don't get really very close to any of those objectives. So it is quite remarkable that Welwyn Garden City, having had its centenary 2 years ago, is still such a remarkable place. So I'm going to talk about two places. The first one is Torna Grain. For those people who know the geography of the UK, it's about 3 or 4 hours drive north of Edinburgh. So you've got to get quite a long way north to go further north. So it's a remote location. And it's around 5,000 houses. It's been going for a little while, and it was developed by the person you see in the bottom left-hand corner, the Earl of Murray. The Earl of Murray has owned that land for around 550 years, having been given the land, his family given the land by Mary Queen of Scots, for services, no doubt, rendered at the time. And he had been involved, his family had been involved in the development of Edinburgh, the new town of Edinburgh. So when he came in the sort of 2002, he wished to see how he could do something that was very significant. That was his objective. And then in 2002, there was the original identification of the potential for a new settlement of about 5,000 houses. And he decided to employ Andres Dwani and Tony Pazaiberg in Miami to be the master planner for that scheme. They'd never done a scheme in the UK. They were in an alien environment, but they came and did that. And then they worked through slowly to develop the ideas and get the permit, and you can see it took quite a long time to go through that process. But he had a vision to do something that was different. The scheme on the left is the actual original master plan. It's about 5,000 houses, 4,960, about 12,500 people. And the scheme on the right is the first phase of that scheme. And he wanted to do something in a traditional format. So when I show you the next slide, which is the road that comes in from the bottom right-hand corner of the first scheme, you'll see that the nature of the place is different. This is right at the start of the development. It's developed over that period of time. The comparator town I'm going to talk about as well is Chapelton, which it was on, you can see, on a very, very fast track. It was only about 5 years between the first idea for the town and the town being built. It's around 8,000 houses in total, and the owner of this town is the bottom left-hand corner, the Duke of Fife, who has owned the land since the 1400s. And larger scheme, originally for about 8,000, also master planned by Andres Dwani, with about 4,045 houses to be built in the first phase. Now, these towns are developed differently from the traditional format. They are operated in what's called a master developer process. So the landowner, here the Earl of Murray and the Duke of Fife, they get the permits, they get planning permission, they build the roads, the sewers, the infrastructure, and then they dispose or sell of individual blocks of land to a developer to build the houses. They promote the town, they build the community, they are the town builders. My job for both of them is to be the executive who does that work and does that activity. And we tend to run across 3 issues on a consistent basis. And these are the issues that potentially prejudice the capacity of doing this sort of thing today. The first one is the issue of regulation, if we call it regulation. You might look at a picture like that and think that looks an entirely reasonable example of some housing. But to the regulator, the city, the approving party, they think that wooden post is unhelpful. They don't like the stone or granite sets in the road because they don't want to replace them, and they don't want a stone wall abutting their road, and they don't like the lamppost, and they don't want the house sign on the road sign on the wall of the house on the right. They don't want any of those things, because any of those things interfere with the smooth organization of how things are managed and organized. They don't want a gradient of that nature, and they don't want a kink in the road. So you start to suffer with all these issues. Roads get developed with streets which are far wider than they need to be. There's far more tarmacadam because everything is driven around the collection of refuse or waste or trash, and not driven around human scale. And very different, very depressing for me when I walk around this theatre and I see the shared surfaces. The attempt to get that which is Douglas Square to be a smooth surface when completed has almost been an entirely sort of a labor of enormous love to try and make that work over a period of time. So when you try to build these new places, you run up against, very often, a degree of regulation. And the issue we have more in the UK than anything else is that's a national regulation as opposed to more local regulations. So the first issue is to build something like Welwyn Garden City today would be almost impossible because of apparent changes in regulation. The second thing is the aspiration of the market. If your aim is to get the market, people who want to build houses to sell, which is very common in the UK market, then you have to get them to try and build them with windows which have appropriate proportion, which might have chimneys, might have enclosures. You look at the stone gates on the side there, all these things. The idea that you would have an open space, an open area where houses front onto that area is not what the market wants to do. The market wants to build the most efficient house type as cheaply as possible to the highest density you can achieve with the least public realm and the least community facilities. That's what the market wishes to do because that's how you make the greatest profit. So all of a sudden you're in a constant tension with the market, which is why the master developer route of doing the town building very often in these circumstances falls to the landowner and not to the developer. The issue of town building is to go through a process of producing a community garden or allotments, to go through that exercise, to set it up, to organize it, to build it, to get people to operate, create, form a society, do all those things, is a very, very challenging process. Right at the start of this exercise, there's a real pressure to build commercial activity, to build a shop, to build a cafe, to do those things, because that is what people want in their daily lives. But the market doesn't want to do that. The market doesn't want to sell to a small shopkeeper, and the market doesn't want to participate in play equipment or open in a cafe that might struggle to compete. And the market certainly doesn't want to hold events and do activities. So all of a sudden you start to see why there's a sort of bifurcation or a split between what the housing market, the developer wishes to do, and what the town builder wishes to do in this environment. If we look at those examples then differently in Chapelton, the most complicated thing that happened in Chapelton, which took 4 years to resolve, is in the right-hand side of this picture, and it's the light on the building. Now, you can go to any city in the world and find lights on buildings, but today, that is a huge challenge. But even in the very first scheme, the square on the left, you'll see there was a cafe and there was some shops. There is a nursery school right at the start of that process. With new settlements, very often all the community facilities are left to the developer. The city abrogates responsibility to do that. At Chapelton, this is the first community building. It's only 50 square meters, but it's a community building built in a park. So it was designed as a park with a building in a park. But when the Duke of Fife wanted to come and build in the park, they said, why are you building in a park? Because it was designed to be so. The mix needs to be very significant, whether the housing is public or state or affordable housing. Why should it be any different to any other housing? And the ability to get retirement accommodation early in the process was something that is a mix of development which is appropriate through life, but not necessarily appropriate to those whose only objective is a profit motive. Again, the same issues, Chapelton and Torner Grain, of allotment gardens, trying to do things in terms of a play park, which is much more significant, and incubation, the idea that you try to incubate businesses so that they then transition into the commercial premises that become available. And then the whole issue of events. You see the bottom right-hand one is the one, the little black building I showed you earlier on. Top left-hand one is the sort of misty, murky, what you think of Scotland, which is wet and miserable. I go there a lot. I can, because there are many academics here, I could give you a very good evidence base to demonstrate that that's actual reality. So what are the things we learn about this process we go through, thinking about tone of grain, and how it's developed and the sort of eclectic nature of what it is? A few things. We really struggle to get people who can design a traditional building. Outside the US, it's almost very, very hard for people to design traditional buildings at scale. When we talk to the planning authorities, they have no concept of large-scale planning on a community basis, on mixed use. No real appreciation at all of that. And the engineering is very, very regressive and negative about the process, based on a worst-case scenario. So the whole process, I spend so much time arguing about roads and radii and curbs, and less time arguing about how you build a place where people want to live and want to be happy in that environment. That's the first part of the process. Second part of the process is the pace of development is very difficult to sustain in many cases. Chapelton has been going for a few years and has built 350 houses. It's in an oil-specific part of the world. It is subject to oil price changes for its economic activity. It was subject to a Scottish referendum on independence and everything like that. But Letchworth built, whatever it was, 1,800 or 1,900 houses in 3 years. Why, after 100 years of activity, can we only build at about a fifth of the rate that they could 100 years ago? No site in the UK really builds around more than 300 houses a year. Letchworth could build 600 to 700 houses a year at that time. So the pace is a real issue as part of this process, as how we go forward and how we develop. But still, the desire to see the central squares, you see at the little parks, all those activities, is really uplifting in terms of the process. And people who move to Chapelton love Chapelton. There is an incredible community bond in Chapelton. But there are three things that I want to close with to show why I find this an incredibly uplifting and an incredibly demotivating thing. As I travel around the world, and I've looked at new towns, new settlements, garden cities across Europe, you know, when you think about the Paradise Plan, the Bob Stern book, you know, the 898 garden settlements in the United States, and you go across Europe, and you go to Australia, and you go to all these different places. It is extraordinarily rare that any settlement, similar to a garden city, or following the garden city principles, has been developed without some individual who has driven that on an ideological basis. That might have been Ebenezer Howard, it might have been Raymond Unwin, it might have been Richard Rice, it might have been Theodore Chambers, it might have been all those people who did that. It might have been the Prince of Wales at Poundbury, it might have been the Duke of Fife at Chapelton, it might have been Robert Davis at Seaside, it might have been John Murray at Tone of Grain. There is always somebody who has an aspiration to achieve a greater objective than otherwise would be developed. As I go through that process, I don't go to any places today, perhaps in the past, today, where I find that a developer or the market or a city is able to produce the quality of environment that the garden city movement espoused and managed to do at that time. That is a really quite depressing factor. The depressing factor is you can regulate it to the bottom, but you can't regulate to the top. So you can put in regulations and standards and planning policies to stop very bad things happening. It's almost impossible through planning policy to achieve excellence. Almost impossible. And if we go back to a character might be very familiar to some, but not others, Sherlock Holmes. When Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes, he said, mediocrity knows nothing higher than itself. It takes talent to recognize genius. Mediocre people don't do mediocre things where they want to. They don't know the difference. And that's the problem with planning in many places, anywhere in the world. So I go through this process. We achieve these sorts of outcomes in my career anyway in trying to do that. I struggle all the time to do it. And it is really, really a grind. People come here and say, isn't this great? This is what we should do. And I say, you go away, you try to do it in your regulatory environment and come back when you've succeeded. very, very tough to see how the Garden City movement, we have Garden City principles, I was talking about just now, in the UK embedded in policy. People produce a plan, it's modest, they say it meets the Garden City principles, and on they go. So whilst there is a degree of, a tone of sort of slightly depressing tone about that, there are schemes like Chapelton and Torna Gray, and I'd urge you, if you ever get the chance to go and see them, they do exist, they have broken the mold, and every day the sun comes up and I think I'm going to go to Chapelton, it's a good day. So thank you very much.
Alors, je vous propose de changer un petit peu le système. Comme Monsieur Roberts doit partir rapidement, peut-être.
The speaker is not using the microphone, but I suppose there's a question in the floor.
Hello. I would like to address the question of parking lots and circulation. The Town Country Planning Association published several guides who say when you do new garden cities, do not build the roads and the parking according to what people want or need, but according of what you wish to obtain. And they say scale down the roads, the parking, so people will stop using cars, basically, if I read correctly. How did you address that issue? Because when we look at these pictures, there's almost no cars over there. Sorry.
That's a depressing question. Okay, so you're absolutely correct. Why should we plan to this situation? So you have houses at Chapelton that they have garages. We cannot count the garages in the car parking count because they might not be used. Every 3-bedroom house has 2 car parking spaces and visitor spaces. We have roads with 10 visitor spaces which are not used on them. It's extraordinarily expensive, and that is because this particular local authority requires you to meet their parking standards across all developments for the particular circumstance. It's really, really depressing. So this is the problem of trying to plan by the worst case. So we can go to a situation which says, if you take somewhere like Poundbury, the Prince of Wales' scheme, there are, I'll quote this slightly wrong, there are something like 2,800 jobs, 1.3 jobs for every house. That is the highest relationship of people working in a place and walking or cycling to work. It's an extraordinary example of what is called internalization, where people work within the community. Notwithstanding that, if you build another settlement in West Dorset, to get them to agree to have less car parking spaces is very, very difficult. So this is a transitional period where at Chapelton we are still grappling with the old car parking standards and old engineering standards from the 1970s, and we're trying to break through that now, and it's very difficult. But it is critical because it's not just the environmental impact, it's the inefficiency and cost of building tarmac roads not to use them.
Merci, monsieur.
I'm an expert for landscaping. Can you explain the operation and the transition? How did you do it?
What is the landscaping policy, and how did you manage landscapes and with parking?
Okay, so the landscape policy, this is it's quite close to the sea, and it's very salty, and it is hard to grow trees. There's only about 2 or 3 trees we can plant which actually grow very well in the circumstance. So originally, there were trees in the street trees, which are very hard to get agreed. Now we've moved away from that and have trees which are in gardens very proximate to the streets. All the boundaries and the landscape boundaries are controlled by the town builder, not by the developer, so they are specified as exactly what they are. And there's a series of, you can see them, little parks. There's one in the bottom left-hand corner. There's a whole series of parks, and there have been 4 built so far. So that's about 1 park for every about 65 houses that have been built so far, which are close to how things operate, and those parks are developed by the town builder and they are landscaped directly by the town builder. So, and we control all the boundary treatments to all the houses. So if you have a house which has a beech hedge, that is specified by the town builder that it will be a beech hedge, or it will be a fence, or it will be a wall. So in terms of the public realm, every edge of every street is controlled, the streets are controlled, and the parks are controlled. So that is a high level of direct control, and it is then there are regulations which stop you changing that if you've got a beech hedge to your house, you cannot change that without approval from the town itself. So a very rigorous system of control, which the developers don't like, and do like sometimes. Okay, anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, for this very convincing presentation. Yes, you deal about a scale of, let's say, little towns, about 6,000 people or somehow more. Maybe, as you know, in France, the model of new urbanism is not very well known, and there is a lot of misunderstanding. When you describe the way of processing, of designing this urban fabric, let's say it's quite traditional, that is street networks, lots, allotments, and regulation. And maybe the critics in France is sometimes about the style. That is, could you imagine these 2 new towns with completely different styles, or let's say also with different kind of architecture, not only this uniform design?
So you probably, yes, I mean, these two particular towns are in the style of architecture that was preferred by the person who owned the land. I do realize, particularly in Europe, there is a great debate, but you'll also see the little community building, the first one that was built, was in a more modern style. It is a case in the UK that most privately driven small new settlements, as opposed to new towns, which is the New Towns Programme, which is a state programme, most new settlements tend to be traditional in style, and they tend to be driven by the owner themselves, who wishes to take a more retrospective approach. So there are a few settlements of this nature that I've been to. There's one, the most significant one I've been to is called Prospect in Colorado, which is a very modern style of a settlement of this nature. But when you think about the Andres Douani approach to development, which is to go back to the transect, to look at how the density development, how to make walkable communities, all those issues, they tend to be based on historic settlements, and they tend to be driven by traditional styles. I think if you change the approach, I'm working on a project at the moment which is slightly different scale, which is worked on, which Dr. Parham might know, which is a whole series of value capture towns between Sydney and Melbourne on a new high-speed rail link. There are 7 towns, they are 600,000 people, and they will be built much more on a very dense, modern approach to a settlement, as opposed to these are quite rural places and they're much smaller in terms of what they are. So I understand the point you make, but these were driven by the owner.
Thanks, Paul. I think this was a fascinating talk. I hope you'll be pleased to know that I teach my town planning students about Tornagrain and about Chapelton as an opportunity to see placemaking in action. But I guess that the style point, I mean, these are driven by vernacular of the place and local character. And I wondered, which is my question to you, what do you think about the use of pattern books and design codes to help, elevate quality? Do you think they are helpful strategies that can support master planners and support communities?
That's quite a conundrum. both these, I'll come back to your pattern point, both these towns were developed on the basis of the initial stages are designed by the owner. So the house builder isn't asked to work to a pattern book. They are told, this is the design for this street, and you can either accept it or don't come to Chapelton. There is a Chapelton pattern book, or called a lexicon. There are about 125 house types in that which are acceptable. And it also has a lexicon in relation to things like porches, windows, walls, all sorts of things of that nature. The concern is, to me, and this is the conundrum, if you're a designer that needs a pattern book, you probably shouldn't be doing it. It's a bit like asking me to try and fix a motor car. I mean, that would really be, with a handbook, that really would be a bad idea, or even find a car. So, when you think about celebration in Florida, which is a very early scheme, which is probably one of the most densely approached pattern book scheme, where you selected your house and you went through that, I think they are a good thing. They're a good thing to inform and help. But if I was trying to select someone to design something for a project we worked on who was relying on a pattern book, that would be difficult. If you are trying to show a direction through a pattern book, I think that's very helpful. But all those things are helpful because of the design deficit we have in the UK, which is very significant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Alors, donc notre deuxième invitée n'est pas là, mais elle nous a...
The next person is not here, she's online, she's not physically here. Is Maria Magdalena Atanasova, who's a designer in an agency, Age Secular Architects, and teaches architecture in Manchester, and she will show us elements about the model of the UK, of DCPA, which is the spirit of Howard and the debate about the Garden City. Bonjour, je m'appelle Maria Magdalena. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous présenter les systèmes en 2010. Excusez-moi de ne pas être là avec vous en personne. Et dû au temps limité, je ne serai pas capable d'aller beaucoup en détail sur la méthodologie de ma recherche. Je vais me concentrer surtout sur les résultats. Mais si vous avez des questions, ça me fait plaisir de vous répondre, soit en direct, soit en email. Vous avez mon email sur le slide. Depuis qu'Ebenezer Howard a créé ce modèle, il a influencé beaucoup l'urbanisme. C'est un concept controversé aussi. Il était reconnu tout au long des années avec beaucoup de bienveillance. Une des plus connues critiques a dit que ces régions étaient développées d'une autre manière. La réalité a été montrée que cette critique faite était quand même un élément caractéristique d'inefficace. Par exemple, quand on va à Letchworth et à Welling, où on peut voir les meilleures pratiques des idées de Howard, les principes de ces meilleures villes étaient très compromis à la fin ou n'ont jamais vu le jour. Il y a à peu près 7 ans, quand j'ai commencé cette recherche, le concept des jardins avait accumulé déjà une centaine d'années de critiques. Dans l'école l'architecture, c'était un modèle du passé dépassé. C'est pour ça pourquoi moi, en tant que chercheuse et architecte, j'ai été surpris de voir que les modèles étaient quand même à la mode au Royaume-Uni. Vous voyez, comme beaucoup de pays développés, on a une crise d'habitat assez importante et en 2010, les cités-jardins étaient présentés comme une solution possible dans la crise de l'habitat. Des politiciens, des économistes, des planificateurs ont réétudié ces concepts.
Inspirations similar to those a century ago, that the garden city had the potential to solve the problems of existing cities. At the time, there were 3 different actors pushing the revival of the garden city model, and they were advocating for their own visions of what the new garden city ought to be. Firstly, the Town and Country Planning Association. The TCPA, as many of you might know, is the organization established by Howard himself to guard his legacy. So they have always been lobbying for a new generation of garden cities. However, in the early 2010s, they were particularly active and their initiatives were really gathering momentum. So they published a portfolio of documents about the principles of building garden cities for the 21st century. As a result of all that lobbying, the leaders of the 3 main political parties in the UK expressed their support for new garden cities. The government published a few planning documents that specifically mentioned garden cities, and it also announced the first 2 garden cities in 100 years, Ebbsfleet and Bicester. So they are the second type of development I will look into. Thirdly, in 2013, the Garden City revival was further encouraged by the Wolfson Economics Prize. This was a context which posed the question, how would you deliver a new garden city which is visionary, economically viable, and popular, and offered a huge prize? So the third type of garden cities I looked at were the proposals that came through this competition. There were a large number of entries, nearly 300 from candidates of all ages and fields of work. And I think this was indicative of the renewed interest in garden cities. Manchester-based practice Urbed won the prize. So in this context, in 2015, I set out to look into this growing relevance of the garden city concept in the UK and try to determine whether this fairly old planning model had evolved to take into account the lessons of the past century, or if its resurfacing was perhaps just a form of nostalgia, or it was simply a politically and commercially convenient appropriation of the phrase garden city, a term that many in the general public don't connect back to Howard's revolutionary planning model, and instead they perhaps just think of nice green space, gardens, trees, maybe detached arts and crafts houses with big backyards. So what is a garden city? Many authors have defined the fundamental aspects of a garden city in order to analyze its relevance. For the purposes of this research, I selected 17 essential characteristics of the original concept as envisioned by Howard, and I divided them into 4 categories. You can see them on this slide. Based on these characteristics, I analyzed the 3 different types of new garden cities by TCPA, by the government, and by the Wolfson Economics Prize. I employed the dialectic methodology, looking at the original idea by Howard as the thesis, the corresponding criticism as the antithesis, and I asked whether the new proposals for garden cities were a synthesis of those 2 or not. Here are my findings in brief. Today, the TCPA still promotes most of Howard's original ideas. The association has moved away from the principles of restricting the role of the government and impacting existing settlements for practical reasons. But apart from these 2, all other 15 principles are kept intact or are adapted to current social and economic conditions. While the TCPA has taken into account some of the garden city criticism, it has neglected past lessons concerning decentralization, urban form, and the creation of garden cities. The custodians of Howard's ideas remain quite prescriptive and authoritarian in their attitude towards urban planning. In recent decades, the TCPA has made a huge step forward by no longer attacking existing cities in order to promote garden cities as their antipode, But I have concluded that the association's work is still far from finding a balance between the original idea and the related criticism. Moving on to the government's garden cities, Ebbsfleet and Bicester. According to most actors involved, most people I interviewed, Ebbsfleet will never deserve the name Garden City. Urbet called it just another housing estate. British author Simon Jenkins said that to call this a garden city is a satire. The TCPA pointed out to me that retrofitting places like Ebbsfleet to garden city principles may be beneficial for them, but without the land value capture aspect, these settlements should not be named garden cities. On the other hand, many believe that Bicester, which was also retrofitted, had more of a chance to become a garden city. According to the TCPA, Bicester was progressive and was the closest you can get to a garden city. It was not ideal, but it was the best example right now. In conclusion, the government's decision not to impose any definition of what garden cities are allowed Ebbsfleet and Bicester, two rather ordinary housing developments, to acquire the garden city status. Both settlements, however, do not address the majority of the concepts defined by Howard. That's why many professionals have warned that today the garden city name is being used as a branding tool by politicians and developers. Thus, Howard's revolutionary idea is reduced to no more than a politically convenient fantasy. Finally, from the three groups of new garden cities I looked at, the Wolfson Prize proposals are without doubt the closest to a synthesis of the original model by Howard and the related criticism. All shortlisted entries demonstrated a good understanding of the flaws of the garden city model and provided new strategies and ideas as a solution. While this can be seen as a manifestation of the responsive and progressive thinking of urban planners today, it should also be acknowledged that those visions for garden cities have transformed the original concept to such a degree that perhaps they should not even use the garden city anymore. For instance, Urbet's winning project does not try to be a reconciliation of town and country. Urbet actually clearly stated that current urban problems cannot be solved by doing the same things we have done in the past, but better. Therefore, their proposal was trying to create something completely new and different. Runner-ups, PRP architects, also stated that they were not talking about the old-fashioned model of a garden city. They were talking about a completely different development, which is more dense, more various, more walkable, better connected. I'm quoting here. So why are all these proposals called garden cities after all? I asked Urbet that question at an interview, and they said that they only called their proposal a garden city because the competition asked for a garden city. They never wanted to design a new generation of garden cities. They just wanted to be part of the housing crisis debate and wanted to join the competition because it didn't seem right to leave it to the garden city people to do, a quote. Interestingly, the only part of Howard's vision that all Wolfson Prize shortlisted proposals clearly retained was its financial model. All entries defined this as the primary characteristic of a garden city. And one could argue that this is the single aspect of a garden city that is fundamentally different to what we have been doing already. Some of Howard's concepts, like walkable neighborhoods, good public transport, lots of greenery, and holistic planning, are now mainstream thought. They might have been quite revolutionary 100 years ago, but now they're mainstream. Land value capture, however, is one aspect that is not common in developed economies and in our planning systems. So the Wilson Prize winning firms did admit that this would be the hardest principle to achieve because of the market situation and the planning system in the UK, but they were also convinced that the Garden City financial model could be updated to respond to capitalist conditions. To sum up, the Wilson Prize proposals use the Garden City principles very selectively, something that the TCPA criticized, but architecture critics welcomed. So if, as a profession, we're happy to step beyond the historical definition of the Garden City, I wonder, shouldn't we also step beyond the name? If we're not planning to be true to the Garden City model, as created by Howard, then why use the term he coined? I ask this not just because we have moved too far away from the original idea, but because people's perception of the Garden City is confused, and that allows politicians, developers, and architects to exploit the positive connotations that come with the Garden City. I think the debate over the Garden City name is important because it is not just an argument over name. It is a debate about what the Garden City should represent. It is a debate about all large-scale housing development in Britain, about the notion of decentralization, about the value of the Green Belt and the future of UK's planning system. Even the most prominent critics of Howard's model nowadays, Lord Richard Rogers, he stated to me that he only opposes garden cities because these are simply names given to new building on greenfield sites. So he wasn't necessarily criticizing the garden city as a model, but the developments that were calling themselves garden cities. So what does a garden city represent today? Well, for the UK government, the garden city is a strategy for delivering housing, very little to no connection to Howard's original ideas. For the TCPA, on the other hand, garden cities of the 21st century closely resemble Howard's original vision. For architecture and planning professionals, however, garden cities are much more. They represent an opportunity. Despite all criticism, there is a value to be had in garden cities, even if only to enable change through their name. Indeed, just as the original idea by Howard, new garden cities have triggered an important debate and have finally engaged politicians in urban planning issues. The garden city debate is therefore a recurrent one, and it embodies the real significance of the concept, the potential of this radical planning model to always trigger a discussion involving not only professionals, but also politicians and the public. It is through this recurrent debate that garden cities pushed urban planning to evolve and move forward in the past, as they do now, and as they're likely to do in the future. Thank you very much, and if you would like to connect, please find my contact details on the slide.
Thanks. Alors, Maria Magdalena, nous ne pouvons pas la voir. Par contre, elle peut nous entendre. Donc, vous pouvez poser des questions.
You're welcome to ask your questions about these real fake garden cities and the factors of, where we stand, and about the brand. Everybody's convinced, I think. Maria Magdalena, I think you were totally convincing, and I think the Assembly people are convinced. Thank you so much. I'm going to call directly many speakers at the same time. And Coste and Mallory Forget, Could you please come up to our panel? Great. Stefan Sadu, Susan Parham, and Matthew Hardy. If you could please come to the front. We have
a return to a more general observation, perhaps, about garden cities. Who lives in garden cities? It's an interesting one. As they were developed, they were aimed, as we saw, with an emphasis both in France and England on cheap cottages for the working class. Really, and in the early post-war period, enormous quantities of public housing were built, and I use the word advisedly, public housing, so for all classes, were built in Britain. After the revolution of the Thatcher era, this declined very markedly today. Practically all housing in Britain is delivered by the private sector. And in the context, as Anna Minton has observed, of a housing market which is intensely financialized, in which property has become an investment class for the global wealth. So, strictly speaking, the provision of affordable housing is regulated, so any development must include affordable housing, which you might assume is working class housing, perhaps. In fact, the definition of affordability is extremely problematic. 80% of market rent, which is to say unaffordable for many people. However, there are one or two notable successes. Poundbury, by the Duchy of Cornwall, has around a third public housing. Surprisingly for many observers, it's delivered by the Guinness Trust, which is a charity along the housing association model, and indistinguishable from the private market housing and mixed in amongst it. So there is some, I think, there are some models which have managed to survive the marketization and the financialization of the housing market in Britain, which has really caused enormous problems for us. But I think, to come to your question, really, we have a problem of definition, and I think perhaps it's fair to say attempted to be answered only by Maggie, who spoke before us, to define exactly what is a garden city and producing 17 categories. And I think this is extremely problematic because, as we've seen in the last 2 days, very, very few, in fact, only Welland has ever adopted Howard's revolutionary system, which was designed exactly to defeat the financialization of the housing market. All the rest, I would say, very largely Parker and Unwin-esque rather than Garden City-esque. And perhaps for clarity of definition, if we talk about the influence of Parker and Unwin, we will have a much bigger and more successfully defined body of work than referring exclusively, as we have tended to, all of us, myself included, to Howard's legacy. And I think what that's tended to mean, as Paul Roberts alluded to, is that anything that's built today, since 2014, since the announcement of enthusiasm for garden cities, is called a garden city because they hope that this will attract attention of the right-wing government that we have. Under the previous administration, it probably would have been described as an eco-city, but the product was probably exactly the same, plus or minus a few Parker and Unwin-style gables and some half-timbering. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
If there's time for one more intervention on this, if we're talking about who lives in garden cities, originally Howard had imagined that actually there'd be quite a lot of small holdings in which people would do their own agriculture and would self-build. And there was, early on, there were kind of parodies and kind of satirical comment about who was attracted to garden cities, that it was people who made their own sandals and wore sort of Hessian sacks and, you know, were sort of back to nature, and kind of it related to the kind of arts and crafts and kind of craft workers guild kind of ideas about place. You know, there was all sorts of things about improvement in dress, and so on that were happening in the 19th century, because so it came out of the utopian kind of ideas about what garden cities ought to do. As it developed, and as you know from the work of Anne and Mallory and others, in the early days they really struggled because it was a commercial development. It had no government underpinning to get people to come and live there. And the exhibitions were there to help attract people to come and be part of the garden city. Of course, it was enabled by Metro land, by the extension of railways out of London. So, Howard's notion of the sociable city, that somewhere like London would naturally decline because people would all want to live in garden cities, actually didn't happen. After the Second World War, quite a lot of social housing was built in Letchworth Garden City. So it's got actually quite high levels of social, that is, housing, which later became kind of reframed as welfare housing in a sense. But there was this kind of tenure mix. But like all other places in the United Kingdom, although Welland has these benefits, as Matthew's pointed out, it is subject to market forces. And of course, this goes back to these points that have been made more broadly today about the fact that the land value capture model and that long-term stewardship it allows, Letchworth is the only place which has managed to retain that. Welland had it taken away through the New Towns process, but Welland managed to, Letchworth managed to hang on to that. And of course that, I think, of course all towns have had difficulties because of COVID and so on, but the income that's generated, that collective income, has allowed it to do all sorts of things to help support its community and to have, in fact, its governance structure is, mostly from the community, as well as a couple of people who are appointed. And so that actually underpins more diversity in both, in who can actually access the benefits of living in Letchworth, because there are extra benefits that collective income requires. And of course, if you saw the archive sources, they've got the most phenomenal archive, and that again is partly because they have had the resources to be able to enable those kinds of supportive services and infrastructures.
Thank you. So,
Oui, on est en train d'aborder en fait.
We are actually speaking about the legacy of the garden cities, not only what is the climate, the architecture, the scenery, as we have seen, can include all kinds of expressions, including densities. And if we go back to the idea of concrete ideas, it's a city where you walk 10 minutes by foot to do whatever you need to do. And this was also the urban form to get a green line and a green lane and a green belt where pedestrians could walk, and it was safer to keep life for children and teenagers. All these elements have been theorized in the United States with neighborhood units and neighborhood communities that came back to Europe as a ping-pong ball, to the UK for Crombie plan in London that allowed it to people to think again about the metropolis and be polycentral city, something that we forgot in France, and I think is something that we could think about. The question is, how can we reinterpret this idea like it's Platon that would be looking at shadows and explaining how the world is working. At least in France, we're no more in the idea to talk about the extensions, have new constructions and neighborhoods, but go to zero artificial net. That means no more takeoff from the land.
So this is talking about urban renewal with a housing area. Now, are they going to be redesigning pedestrian walkways? There's a question of biodiversity as well, or let's put it, hydraulic installations. There's also the question of real estate, which comes back, and it comes back in terms of, what are public areas, what are private areas. Is there room? Is there a possibility to have shared areas, commons, and how could they be managed, bought and managed? So we get back to this contemporary concern, as it was described in France, of ideas, or a kind of a reference that could also echo the ideas of the garden city. But on the American side, in the neighborhood units, the neighborhood communities, with a series of plannings in architecture schools, they took off with this, David Mangin, with the idea of reforming sector-based to urban approach. We're going to take 2 questions right away. My thought is that for the last 2 days, it's antinomic that after the war, the public authorities with 1% are building garden cities with public funds and quality garden cities, because they are still standing today, even if there are some termites. Whereas today, we're arguing over quality. Is that why, in your studies, that the partners and public authorities and whoever else is queried recognize that as being strange and you can't do quality today, or is it because we are in a point in time where there's a difficulty, there's a housing crisis, is an ecological transition, and all of that is linked? Is that why? What are your thoughts about that? I'd like to take advantage of this to answer, but before we move on to questions of urban forms, there's one aspect we haven't spoken much about in the last couple of days in Howard's ideas. Is he's not a planner. You shouldn't say that he's a planner. He's not someone he didn't want to think the city in the place of the families and his workers. He was defending a principle, which is that of the image, which is very present in everything he does. And we worked a lot on the primary sources and the basics of Howard in all of his conferences. It comes out a lot, is the idea to do something that it must be a model. And it was at the initiative of new communities and new groups of inhabitants, something that we wanted to promote the education of and want to try to contribute to doing.
Looking at the kind of contrast between the kind of master planning and planification of the garden cities and then the way we shifted towards a kind of more Radburn layout, neighbourhood unit, kind of Clarence Perry, kind of Stein kind of model. Yes, and this is a kind of an absolutely classic key part of what happened in the 20th century. And I think that we see, both in Parker and Unwin's plan for Letchworth, and then de Soissons' plan for Welland Garden City, an incredibly subtle kind of human-scaled kind of approach in which, there was I think Camillo Sitter was an influence on their thinking and on the way that they did the plan forms, but it was beautifully composed, at a very human scale with a really fine attention to the detail of residential streets. So, but by the time we got to the kind of thinking that John Reith and Abercrombie and others were doing, Osborne were doing in the 20s and 30s, and then actually put into practice in the early post-war period, they were playing around with neighbourhood unit models, Radburn, sort of Swedish kind of housing, kind of sort of housing models. I'm sure you know all this, and of course they were. What had happened, the tipping point was that instead of planning around people's needs and human scale and walkability, they changed to planning around car movement. And that utterly transformed the Newtown way of making places. And I think that's when we really had a kind of a really radical shift away from Garden City master planning. And I guess it's one that we're now wanting to retrofit, because it's turned out to be, in some ways, quite dysfunctional. And that we need to find ways to get compact, mixed-use, walkable, active travel-enabled places. And garden cities, with their capacity for green infrastructure and some of their other things they do, and of course here you've got really interestingly quite high densities, but I think at different density levels, and using maybe transect approaches, or my kind of ideas of convivial green space, if you like, There's so many possibilities, I think, for this not just to be a legacy, but actually a really live source for us. It's not just about nostalgia, and I noticed that wasn't actually defined in the talk about that. This isn't for me just about the past. This is actually about about now and the future, and our capacity to make places which are resilient in the face of climate change, habitat loss, soil and water degradation, and all the absolutely urgent things that we're facing.
Est-ce que... Allez, je peux... Ah, pardon.
Ginette va poser sa question peut-être, et ensuite tu pourras rebondir.
Oui, je voudrais vous poser une question qui a l'air peut-être...
I'd like to ask you a question which is not exactly on topic, but the English speakers are really the first in questions of urbanism and social housing every time we look at history, including urban utopias and so forth. Here, I'd like to know what you're doing, because we're taking care of our garden cities. We call them cités-jardins, but they're basically quarters, neighborhoods. In Howard's imagination, you know, he thought about 32,000 people, which we didn't reach for a long time. But we were talking, the French are talking about eco-quartier, or new cities. We started new cities, and they provided for land. We have more land that belongs to the government to build than we have projects. So that's something that was very important. And here, for the last few years, with the idea that we need to save the planet, the idea of eco-quartier, and the British were there as well. We've all redone a pilgrimage very quickly. We all went, and we sent pictures as well, you know, from anywhere around Great Britain to look at any eco-quartier we could find. We found that they were all wonderful and magic. Then COVID happened, and we could no longer travel. There was no more exotic. You know, the last urban idea was no longer exotic for us. Even though Great Britain was the most magic place to see those things, to see if you have kind of buried eco-quartier the way we forget to go to see them.
Speaking as an Anglo-Saxon, we voyage to France when we can, COVID permitting, to look at your eco-quartier, because in some respects they seem much more successful than ours. Having said that, and having recently led a tour of some of the new quarters of East London in the Royal Docks, I've seen some new eco-quartier which perhaps begin to approach the quality of some of what I've seen in Nantes and other French cities. So I think it's one of those things that one is always, as we say in English, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And now I've seen recently a scientific paper proving through some optical illusion or optical framework that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And I must say, especially following Brexit, the grass is very much greener on the other side of the Manche, perhaps. But to go back to the previous point about no further concrétisation of soils, which is a really interesting policy that we've seen from across the Channel. I mean, traditionally that's been handled in Britain by prioritising development of what we call brownfield sites, former industrial sites, old airfields and so on. Of course, those are not always located in the best places. And so it can be problematic if you have a brownfield site which is not connected to transport. It may be better for that to be rewilded than to become a new urban centre and some desolate piece of hard-packed industrial or agricultural land become a settlement. Because one of the things we know is from scientific research is that gardens, domestic gardens, are much, much more biodiverse than agricultural fields by a huge factor. So the transformation from a wheat field sprayed with insecticide 12 times during the cropping cycle to a domestic garden isn't necessarily a loss of biodiversity.
I feel like I'm answering too many questions, but I'd just something on eco-quartier. In the UK, it's an attempt to develop eco-cities in the early 2000s. And there were some fantastic ideas. And in a couple of instances, they became reframed as new kind of garden towns. So Upton in Northamptonshire, which was an eco-city, when the political winds changed, became a garden town. So, new name, same ideas. But they were good ideas. But the thing that stopped the eco-cities from happening, eco-towns happening, was politics. That there was a lot of pushback locally from people about the fact that they felt that what any new development was going to be worse than what was there already. It was going to have pressure on services. There would be more people driving around, harder to go to the doctors, harder to get to see someone in hospital, all the things that really worry people about their places. The views of green fields being taken away, all those kinds of things, although these were going to be on former brownfields. And so it was the politics of the situation which made that fall apart. So in fact, that, as where we started with our talk today, was that one of the reasons why I think there was a return to interest politically in garden cities, but now reframed as garden cities, garden towns and garden villages, so different kinds of scales, was that this was seen to be more politically acceptable and would have less pushback and less immediate sense of we just don't want it, whatever it is. And Paul talked, I think, really well about the process by which these aristocrats who owned these lands, in his examples, went through developing it with people. They did quite a lot of co-design and using charrette processes, which I think are really interesting processes. And in fact, our local aristocratic developers use those processes very effectively to really bring communities in and find out their ideas and reflect those, so that there's not a sense that you're just having this new development, garden city or otherwise, done to you, but you are part of that process and it's reflecting local preferences, needs, and kind of capacity for human scale, food-centred, that's what I'm into, walkable, ecologically based places. But so effectively I think that eco-quartier and garden cities can cover very similar territory, actually, in terms of what they do, as long as the process of getting there and the content does those, meets those kinds of principles of human-scaled and human-focused placemaking.
J'ai promis en 30 secondes, je vais essayer de faire 3 réponses.
I'll try to do 3 answers in 30 seconds. Madam, about the question, a very good question, about how about the peri-urban. I'd invite you to look at my colleague's Susan, because there's an answer that she contributed to the Concours Wilson and tried to show how the principles of architectural composition in garden cities can be used to repair peri-urban areas. Madam, about your question having to do with the after period, there's an answer which is a bit cynical. One of the problems we did not talk about was acceptability of new projects for housing, a lot of housing not too far away from those who were there in the green area or non-constructible area. And it's much easier to get a project, a building permit through for 5,000 new one when it's stamped a garden city than when the stamp is something else. And you can see there's consultations. And the last response, I'm trying in 30 seconds to Madam about the question of quality. The presentation of Paul Roberts seems illustrates very well my thought. Those that today have every interest in producing quality, whatever you think of the style, it seems to me that there are quality in the projects that were presented to us. These are the big landowners, because their interest is to make it so that by descending, there'll be owners of those lands in 500 or 600 years down the line that can still make money from those properties. It's very British, I know, but the promoters today, what they're interested in is short-term profit. And we can see it's a bit provocative, but today, those that are resolving the housing crisis so easily, the ones that have their hands on the real estate, it's not normal, but that's the way it is. I can't talk about France. I think we're starting to touch upon the pain points, and I suggest that now, just 5 minutes break. I know it's hard, I know it's hot, I know that you're tired, but we have a panel discussion that's of great interest in one last intervention, and really would like to hand over to you and have time for questions. So 5-minute break to just refresh for some refreshments.
j'espère pas. Non, non, enfin, non, non. Il n'y a pas de souci, voilà. Pour l'instant, 1, 2, 3, oui peut-être. Autrement, de toute façon, il y en a des filants. Et puis, je vais essayer de faire la retape pour les faire revenir. Il faut les laisser un petit peu. Donc c'est bon, c'est le bon. Oui, c'est bon, voilà. Voilà, on a.
Ladies and gentlemen, we still have a couple of sessions before the end of our seminar, and our latest exchanges will be extremely interesting because we're talking about actual and future questions. So we are going to have a last presentation of Dorian Bianco, who is at the Sorbonne University as a doctoral student, who is asking what is the influence of Garden City as a residence architecture. And I would like as well to introduce our roundtable participants, Émilie Jarussin, who is urbanist in Institut Parisien, Émeric Lambert, who is an architect engineer, Dr. EPFL, just say your titles teacher at the École nationale d'architecture in Versailles and associated with Park Architects. Of Caroline Deschil as well, architect director of TVK, and Malo, who is a doctor of architect and research manager in the same agency. So you see names and people of very different areas, and you can be a researcher, a practitioner, and everything on the same time, and it's fantastic. So I will give the mic to Dorian. So I hope you can hear me. I will continue with an exercise of thinking about a garden city as a model of peri-urban spaces, but mainly of a transition to a closed fuchsia as a model for spaces and reorganize peri-urban spaces for the future. It's a way back to the ideas of Howard in the first edition of 1880 to go to a Pacific movement and a form, talking about the changes of the urbanism in a future time. So you have the books and the title that you can see here in the cabin of what can be future's city in the spirit of news from the world. You will be imagining the motto of the future in a nice atmosphere, and it's going to be an exercise that is not visual, even if I'm working on architecture, because I'm in fundamental studies with scientific approaches. Will be applied research and ask myself, can we use historical knowledge of our model in order to imagine a reform of urban architecture around cities. So I will be trying to talk about the challenges of the initial city and show what are the differences between France today, and ask myself if there are possibilities to make a reform. Cities, we have told a lot of things in the past, and even if things have to be repeated, Howard does not define an architectural model by itself, but in different mixture of socioeconomic elements where community can think about and planify a community around a city. This autonomy would go through means like having people being motivated, mobilized, and on this space, Howard will be, you will see the second diagram of 2018. But a new city that would have 450 hectares. It was a huge project. My first proposal is the city is like a magnet, and you have a city that is polluted, that has road country, nice, picturesque, hygienic sanitation and advantages of the town, and the city that has all the equipment with infrastructures and social security, as had been said, work and having social support, and having the presentation of all the services of cities. And this redevelopment of city gardens shows us that these areas and districts would be suburbs, like gardens, more than anything else. It's not a city garden, but it does not correspond of individual houses that have been presented in the beginning of the period, and that you can go to the diagram 7 on the right side of the slide. We will see the social cities that organize a constellation of satellites around a central city, because the city garden of Howard is many satellites that channel the evolution and the growth of the city with the new towns, which is a realization of city gardens. But these cities have been realized by town country planning, meaning what we say in France, urban planning. We had engineers like Vichy, and later on Jean-François Gravier made publications in 1950. And there was, during the Vichy period, a proposal of satellite cities. We have to talk of a program of reorganization of our municipalities and of cities. In France, there's lots of literature about these subjects, but Howard would like to organize the distribution of the spaces and the uses of the spaces for industrial use, for agriculture, and for lodging. And you need services close by. So the aspect of gardens is an approach of all problems linked to the subject, like social and health. I think this is an original design of Denmark, of city gardens. On the left side, you have Charles Jacobson, who is from Denmark. He's an architect and he's a city planner. And in 1923, he called his project of centralized decentralization. In order to channel growth, you have to use satellite cities with ideas that you will have after the period of a maximum size of cities. You have the same concept with Howard. These ideas from Charles Jacobson has been influences from organizing Copenhagen And you will see on the right side Storkenbahn, that is a great area of Copenhagen, that is an urban planning that is trying to combine 5 axes of satellite cities, and you will see the green belts. So people can have access to public transportation and green belts and forests. But it was never done in France in a similar way like the Danish people, because this model does not create new cities, but to decentralize existing centers. It is important to understand the evolution, because we've seen peri-urban areas with individual houses in suburbs away from the center. And this creates a new middle class that loves green spaces and loves as well all the services offered by cities. It's an advantage of the town-country magnet. If you use this ideal town management magnet, it's a way of improving and reorientating the urban planning that we could not do in France to satisfy the requirements and desires of French people that wanted an individual house, like it has been done in Copenhagen, with a balance of the territories, with gardens and so on. I have the impression there are a few advantages that are quite interesting in the model of Howard as of today. And I believe that we can see a city garden like a project of urban planning. It has to be done before the urban planning of services, of schools, of infrastructures, and that's a very interesting approach. A speaker this morning talked about gentrification in Spain, this balance between the territories and their usage in order to be able to decide how to organize small residences outside a centrum. In the 60s, we called that a geography voluntary of lodging, to avoid to have too big cities or too many oversized cities like Paris. And today we talk about ecological transition and decarbonization. And that can be combined with these neighborhood units of Clarence Eric, which is American urbanist, who was part of the association in America, about the movement of city gardens in America. If we go lower to the peri-urban level, you can see that this peri-urban level would allow to think in these images, for example, the structure of the parcels and of the land pieces. How do you make the operation where these different buildings are owned by people and dividing the territory? This would be an advantage to avoid the degradation of the landscape, and the ecological dimension is not always coherent. So when you have an architect that is coordinating, everything helps to give a designed approach. And I would add, thanks to these different forms, you can try to find the ideal density of lodging. There's been many works on this subject, and I would say the big difference with city gardens and Lex Works or Wending Ancestors or Manstead is to create a balance between big surfaces and capacity of the buildings that could be more dense. But may I remind you that the ideas of Howard still live in the density of 200 to 225 inhabitants per land unit. So it's a city that access to the land. That is a question of intermediate lodging that has been studied several times and could change the differences between downtown and suburbs. This intermediate density is very interesting because it could be an organic response to reform the old constructions that exist in the traditional history in France, and instead of having individual houses in a simple bit of land, you can imagine that every place has its history and we can adapt it and repair a nice landscape. I'll try to show you the next slide. Garden city means to choose to have lots of gardens and think about other models of urbanism. For example, imagine to make a new model, a new living area next to the already existing city. But what happened since many years, we never stopped to go the other way, densify urban spaces by using ADEM studies, make a city in the city. The other initiatives, as you can see to the right, increase my backyard. I wouldn't talk a lot about the instrumentation of vertical growth because of real estate interest, but we made projections and we know we are not going to have a growth of population as it stands that they imagined 50 years ago, but we can still continue a little bit to create new lodging next to the cities in the peri-urban area. There is a need to densify the cities without destroying the landscapes, but I believe there is a bad estimation of ZAN, zero actual surface, and they asked to create the same surface as a green space that was not built before, including a creation of gardens and individual houses. And a sociologist, Ijan, said ZAN does not take into consideration adding nature because we have a very artificial way of doing our calculations and computations. And sometimes in some gardens you have a very strange mathematical presentation that land would not be as good as a model similar to garden cities. So let's see what is the interesting model for the future. This is my last slide. If the intermediate form is something you can see with those houses, let's speak about architecture. And I think it would be interesting to see what a city garden can be interpreted on the different regions, because regional architecture doesn't mean we should make a historical building again. Doesn't mean either the modern movement on industrialized. We have social and economic reusage and ownership of homes. Use your home, use your garden, rehabilitate existing structures. But we could also see in international context there's a regionalism, and regionalism were one of the evolutions of architecture by Claire Fantôme, and I mentioned Denmark, and we talk also about a functional tradition in order to find the European identity, like in cities like San Francisco with a modern construction. So you will have an evolution of architecture and adapt past into present. In France, there's a domination of industrialization of old-looking aspects. A part of the responsibility is linked to the fact that people don't estimate, and especially architects, scorn individual houses, and it's very difficult for an architect to have something else than a monument or a creation. So it's despite this scorn, we would like to know what do people want to have and what do they want to live. In the 80s, we asked for a more traditional approach. Many times we go back to the past with modern industrial materials, having a look of the region of architectural regionalism that were based on projects that existed in the past but with modern materials. So we promote real estate in that way. And often we talk about these architectural problems of quality architecture to solve the problems of architecture quality. There's a legal and political frame of a law called CAP. I'm done. Saying that these laws are unable to eliminate architects when the one-house family homes are made by others than by an architect. Only 5% of their homes were made by architects, and this figure by itself speaks a lot. So it would be good to have the influence of architects again in these pay-urban spaces, and we need a radical solution. I believe we can get out if we use the state to give the orders to traditional builders on site, and in that way buildings will be decarbonized as well. And especially, I believe, by changing the projects of architecture, especially in universities of architecture, including the human dimension. That's something that started to disappear recently. We have workshops, and I believe we should reinforce the roles of architects of historical monuments and architects of Bâtiments de France and give back the control that they lost by architects. And that's my last sentence of a service of Beaux-Arts for social lodging, for spaces and gardens next to social housing. And these were the changes of the innovation. I'm sorry, I cannot do my conclusion, but you have here my slides, and it's written here. And I thank you of having a look of these models. Thank you very much.
On va prendre une question. Alors, je ne...
One single question. I'm sorry. It's an interesting subject, but we're late. I know there are many teachers in architecture schools and architectures in the room. And then we go immediately to the round table. Maybe somebody from the round table would like to take the words. My question is, what is your standpoint? Because we're going to have a different approach of a different round table of creating a city. The idea for me and for my colleagues is to see what is the position of the architect, creator, of being interested to see your historical approach and proposals, because we might have similar positions, but we have a very different starting point. As a matter of fact, I think there's lots to say. That's why we're here. We're here to talk. Okay, let's warm our microphones. Une seule question de la salle.
All of these very important questions. There are concerns, and we have a lot of questions, and I agree with the, journalism sends back to it seems that in everything we've heard, there's one element that's lacking, and that is the landscape. When you talk about a voluntary geography, it seems to me that the idea of the site and geography, it plays on the regional, but in Plessis-Robinson, I don't know if you could talk about landscape. It's not going to be fun. If you talk about landscape and location and site, and also the question of how do you draw the outside spaces, which often in these interventions are reduced to food or responding to ecology questions, but we're not really thinking about the design, which should be a fully part of the project. It seems to me that's something that's lacking somewhat. I'd say that even sometimes I wonder if the way we talk about landscape doesn't lead us to systematically forgetting what really makes a place worth living in a project of this kind. When you're thinking about garden cities, this whole drawing, which is so fundamental, and you talked about examples earlier, we could have talked about the green drawing on outside areas and design. Ultimately, since it's not important, let's go for it. We'll just gloss that over. Maybe we'll keep a few trees. But it seems to me that this is an essential factor to regenerate, including architecture and the surrounding landscape, multi-scatter or whatever. But I teach at the landscape school, so that's where I'm coming from. Do you have a quick answer? In 20 seconds, I agree totally. I think that what you need to bring back is something that's picturesque, and that's going to evoke the whole idea of landscaping, and I agree. I tried to talk about that briefly, this whole idea perhaps of improving the appearance of the way into the city, with the idea of maybe understanding that a project, an architectural and urban project, has to be part and parcel of a local territory, which has a specific landscape and appearance. In Normandy, you can do something that rhymes with Normandy, maybe apple trees. Thank you. I think there's still one more question. And so the discussion is taking off, so that's great. Because we didn't have much time to exchange, and if this can be if we can speak freely and constructively, it's wonderful. I'd like to grab onto what was just sent out by Bernadette, which rhymes with what we wanted to talk about, but I wanted to get back to the idea of picturesque landscapes. The approach that we try to develop and have done so kind of recently over the last few years at the TVK agency is kind of an approach that comes, picturesque is a category in art history that talks about what we see, and in fact, maybe not what we see in practice, but what's important and their landscape people, it's another level that we're talking about, and maybe maybe the form isn't all that important. It's how you put it together with what materials, and how do you respect what's there already, and the dynamics that are already there. And the question of form is very contextual for us. It depends on the existing context, and what we're trying to do above all is to see what we're going to be seeing, and the resultant is that you have to see what's on the ground and what we can put around it. I'll hand over to Caroline because she can present the project a little bit of the garden cities. I don't know if we can have perhaps the map. Could we have the map? What page is this? Here we are talking and showing what we have in the media near the Bourget. Immediately next to the Georges Valbon Park in Courneuve. In the top you have L'Air de Vent. When we started the project, it was with the team immediately realized that we were part of an exceptional landscape, and we had to make do with it. And right away, we said to ourselves that the site we were supposed to build on, that's not where we should be building. On the contrary, it was the site we had to depollute and give back to nature. So maybe you can see in the lower left-hand corner is a Terrain des Essences, which is a former military enclave in the park Georges Valbon. And there was a pigeon house, which was normally meant to be built. And it was very quickly went towards the edge of the wood, L'Air des Vents, which in fact was an open space for events. And it was already a zone that was co-inhabited between humans and non-humans, between various usage of polyvalent, as it were. So there's an opportunity here to install a neighborhood that was somehow lacking in the city, to create a bond with the future train station that was arriving in the middle of a park. And so we came to work based on that. And in order to maintain and reinforce an ecological corridor. And it's based on that work that we came to propose a porous city strategy where the urban forms were fragmented and alternating with open spaces, with buildings, and to open up that kind of dialogue. And it's based on that work on open spaces that we're gradually, the idea gradually appeared of a garden. And in the continuity of the work on living in the landscape and the whole idea of the city. So it's based on these two terms that in 2019 we started to determine the project as the garden city of the 21st century, with the notion that we didn't have initially, but which presented itself to us to go further in our thought process so as to impregnate ourselves with history of the landscape and to work on the vegetal construction of the site and to seek a bit more the context and the buildings that we initially had thought would be homogeneous, but to fit those into a park that was less contextualized than what we had thought of doing as soon as the project name kind of appeared. So from there were born three different neighborhoods, the one we called Lanière, which follows the continuity, the green continuity between the park Georges Valbon in the west and the eastern area. And now this quarter was a bit seeking to the gardens. You can see these garden areas. And another quarter, much more on the slope, we have lots that are terraced. And each area, each quarter, has its own identity from the characteristics they're in the geography of that landscape. So it's based on that we were able to work on all of that. And based on these urban forms, this whole work was extremely related to open spaces and a hierarchization of these open spaces, which is one of the strong features of city gardens. You can see that the project is situated in a big park and a big landscape system. That all of the work that we did consisted in creating a gradient in these open spaces to move from a park-type system over to a more peaceful area where several usages coexist and where there are shared and private areas, right, and working on private gardens and the whole idea of a threshold. So all of these quarters, which initially were backed by major streets or major departmental routes that you see here, so we redivided up the project into quarters so we could get back to a more human scale and a more peaceful scale, and which echoes much better the existing cités-jardins garden city, whether it be Aiguillé and Moulin. So it's true that the idea of a city garden that didn't come from our team of designers, but it helped us to get deeper into the whole idea. We attach a great deal of importance to the insertion and the anchoring in the ground, in the soil, and the geography. Right from the beginning in the team, we had an ecologist who was also a landscaper, and all of that was linked together in some way. And certainly there are things that could be said about the project, but these particular themes for us helped us to get further and more deeply into what we wanted to make appear. Could you talk about the number of housing units? I know it's hard to get down into nitty-gritty details, but in all, in these three neighborhoods, there are roughly 1,200 housing units. This corresponds to 300 or 400 housing units per quarter, which really corresponds to the existing area in the city. That's the way it was built as well, based on city gardens, and even the new areas that are being built have that similar gauge for housing. While we're at it, could you go back over, or either one of you, the idea of inheriting the soil that I found striking in what you did? I could perhaps respond to add to what Caroline said. Now, in the agency, I observe what my colleagues are doing and try to sit back and take a look at it and to help us think. No, well, I go back and forth. Yeah, I go back and forth, let's put it that way. And so what I found striking in the form of this neighborhood and in the form of the open spaces was the choice of not having built in the Parc de la Courneuve, which would have enchanted the promoters, perhaps, but was kind of an ecological aberration. The idea was to have anchored this on the existing departmental road, which was an area that was not urban. So these were not urban spaces, and which nonetheless made it possible to draw, to have a line between there and the Bourget, and to hook onto that existing infrastructure, and to push our infrastructure, which had very complex terraces and very marked with hills and so forth. And the logical thing, initially the project was going to be backed up in that way. There were a lot of buildings that were going to be hooked directly onto the roadway. But the hills were an ecological heritage from the site, and that's why all of the Lanière areas are disconnected from the road system, which encourages, in fact, the quarters that are. There's a whole strategy about a significant reduction in the place occupied by cars. I think it's not in the PowerPoint, but there's one picture that talks about how we try to conserve, to a maximum extent, the terracing. which was produced by previous generations. And we know and we know how much a carbon cost there is in changing terrace. So the idea was anchoring this in the context. Yes, so work was done to limit, too much earth moving, and to try to reuse what was present on the site, obviously depending on the quality of the actual earth there. But we did some fine-tuning and some streamlining in the landscaping by trying to use what was existing already, and the paths that used by animals as well, and the flora and the fauna and the geography, everything that was already there on the site. So there we are. Thank you. Emily, would you like to speak? Yeah, this particular project I'm not aware of, but be that as it may, I work for the I work on following up sustainable quarters in the Paris region. So this is for the government and the eco-label constructions, which enables us to have a great panel of 100 sustainable neighborhoods, so that I can kind of give you a summary after 10 years of where we stand in these particular projects. And these are coming alive now, and how they're built. So without going over their project, which I don't, and most of the neighborhoods that I followed have the same kind of vision, taking into account the existing landscape, the ecology, and so forth. We hear these, but what I wanted to say is to say, in addition to that, is that above and beyond the importance of the landscape and nature, the rest that comprises a sustainable neighborhood, which shows similarities with the cités-jardins. When you talk about something sustainable, this is a big area. It's usually a big project. It's a project that is mixed very often. So it's a mixture of societal and functional. We have services and functions, as is the case for many garden cities. Not all, but these are sustainable neighborhoods. We're starting to talk about connections, whether it be connections to buildings or the neighboring centers, mobility, how we're going to get around in the neighborhood. We're going to be thinking about everything to do with energy strategies, agreement between inhabitants. There's a real diversity of these sustainable neighborhoods, not just buildings and planted areas. So, for example, this is an operation that's ongoing at Massy. It's the Ville-Genisse quarter that was labeled new ecological in 2018 or 19. And almost, as was the case in almost all of the neighborhoods I spoke about, we have a lot of neighborhoods that are sustainable, that are part of urban renewal. We had an Air France site of 15 hectares. We tried to recover as much as many buildings as we could, but we also 2 hectares of just additional land surface, and we tried to connect all of this to the city of Massy. We thought about the strategy of the neighborhood as a whole. We thought about waste management, about protection of most of the trees. I don't know if there are any other pictures.
Ah d'accord, bon, c'est pas grave. Donc j'en avais mis d'autres également.
I had some additional pictures in my presentation just to show you that we have also different ways of using public spaces and way of being linked to the city gardens in Issy-les-Moulineaux or in Saint-Antoine, shared gardens and diversity. We want to talk about cités-jardins. That is an example of asking for students that are very curious. They study architecture And I see heads moving and agreeing that very often it's something that you remember while you were studying. So I wonder, what do you remember from your study trips? Because it's like visiting a specific place and that you will visit with your school. It's an initiatory trip. You compare Saint-Lazare, Estaing, garden cities, and I will answer the other way. I've never been in a garden city during my studies. I read only in the books, and that is our problem in the agency, that it's called park architects, that we never had the areas where I grew up in the periphery, where I studied in 3 different architecture schools, which were all on the suburbs, and we will only talk about ville ancienne, or old cities or metropolis that we would have in the history of postmodernism and modernism that we have inherited, that is even better. And then when we went to our schools in Lausanne and Nordenham, we were in a place that was a city with bungalows or pavilions. And that's the way why we wanted to say, we ask ourselves questions. We started from the problem that we never spoke about subjects that we could find and see. I made a research of the urban process. It's an adventure of exporting urban comfort to the land that was a subject on the 19th and 20th century. It's a cultural trip, and I wrote a book to understand better the form and see how things happen on practical level with great ideas, but we still don't know how to do it. So we asked ourselves, we should ask ourselves about the form. And that's why we came to the idea of a park in a network. That's a city that different centers where you will have a building with green space, more homes, supermarket, infrastructure, buildings, offices, and then all these things are linked. It works great if you have networks of water, telecommunication, and vehicles, but it has no form. It's an opportunist of speculation of real estate that you will create these constructions, but suddenly, one day you discover that garden cities exist, and there's a form, and it's an idea, and there's success, and we discover ruin, and that's a revelation. Because we understood what we can do with a piece of land, trees, buildings, a garden, and other elements. A fence made of trees and so on. We try to see this small review, and we made only one review. Those days we had time. And it's good now we're too occupied, and the idea would be there are people that have success at doing things. Maybe we should learn. And we didn't learn those things in school, but we should learn in life and create these different spaces. We visited gardens, we measured surfaces, we asked the people and tried to understand what their relationship is for the architect that is searching for solutions without a method, and starts to use his imaginations and design something new. There was no method, but on the other side, we have no problems with the different disciplines. We mixed up all the things, and finally, you have to make a project. I don't know if we have other images from this review, but we went to a workshop and started making the designs with models. On the left side, you can see the work we made on the street. and whether this is our solutions. We're too young to construct our own house, but we started with the models and the dimensions that you can see here on the left side of the screen. These were our efforts to realize, is there a way to make a transformation of a garden if we have to do that in real life, because the vegetable garden is great and it worked well because we had a builder, we had a investment company, and they gave us both buildings and landscape. And if you present a project, you have a group of architects that generally will have a global approach, and they will try to see if you have something new. And these are all the daily subjects, and you have a catalog to check the different points to satisfy. So it was something great. We could create something. City gardens, we made 2 districts. We won both of them, but none of them was ever realized. These neighborhoods learned us one thing: we have to start with the landscape. If we have the landscape and we have the surface, we can ask ourselves, how do you move from one place to another? Where will you put the institutions? And then you start to put an important building somewhere, let's say a school, a metro station, a parking before taking the metro. And then you start living there. And as an architect, every time you ask yourself, I started with the buildings, and we made a construction, and we have a town sign of simply a group of housing development that makes no sense. And everybody is asking us to do that. Investment companies, cities, they just say, do your planning in the frames of the urban planning legislation. And you have neighbors a little bit everywhere, not always. Have your houses aligned. You can use trees, you can use streets, but most of the things are just next to another limit or another lot of construction. So we realized we won the competition, won the prize, but it was complicated to create this district. It's a very long-term process. We're architects, and we said, we're architects, we're not urban planners, let this work be done by urban planners. We do our architectural work, and that's it. That's how we arrived to our approach, and that's why we're speaking here today. Questions from the floor? The person is not using a microphone. It's great. I was waiting that somebody could mention the idea of the beginning of a project. How does a city garden of the 21st century start? We are a team. I'm an architect myself, and we are in the region of Pas-de-Calais. We start on a competition for a city garden on the 21st century. And I'm going to talk about the steps that is different from what you have described, because we're trying to write something in order to be able to convince politicians to accept our projects, to support it, and start with a competition as a competition dialogue. And the first step that we thought of today is do the work together with urban planning. And what I can hear since yesterday is that there's a need of work to be done of people doing landscapes. What is the balance between urban planning, landscape planner, and architect? I'm sure you have some questions. What do you think, which one should be the first? The landscaper, the architect, or the urban planning? I would start with the landscape as you have it. We took the lines that existed before we destroyed it, the landscape implanting homes. And that has a consequence that we had to make 3 neighborhoods, but the landscape was different, so they wouldn't be the same. So we use the existing elements and we adapt to the landscape. And what's complicated, we need a project for the landscape that is good for all projects. I think you need a little bit of landscape and you start of it and then add with a little bit of urban planning, but not too much. And politicians start feeling, I need images, I need to tell you that we are starting to worry and we are impatient to have your pictures, your designs. Because what is a street? A street is something simple that has to be varied a little bit, and very often they're expecting things from us and they want us to be fast, show something, but there's a lot of pressure. But when I have a look of the examples that you have presented over there, I'm not sure having understood which side did you start of your zero phase. Where did you start off? One other thing I don't understand is where is this side? What is it all around it? If we could zoom out. It was not easy to choose the right pictures for the PowerPoint. Yeah, this one. I'm not sure we will understand. Clearly you have the buildings. In red is the project. The white zone with the big black buildings is Le Bourget, the airport. And the circle on the left is Stade de France. So we're next to Paris in the territory of, there's a big park called Georges Valbon in Courneuve, and the site would be within Plaine de France area, embedded in the park. We have the airport continuing on the right side, and we made our intervention in the beginning in a competition that started with the department number 93, and we had a dialogue for the competition. For 1.5 years we won the competition because Paris became candidate for the Olympic Games, and things have changed. Program has been more precise. We started to work on all these questions of the Olympic Games, and then there was a change of organization and partners because of the Olympic Games, and it was no more the same project. The fundamentals were still there, but the whole phase of study and exchange with the authorities and the elected representatives was ready. But when we started the competition with the department, you see this area within the red lines in the park. We were supposed to do the project over there in this park area within the red dots, and not where you will see the big black box, which is a logistic building. And we said to ourselves, it's not logical to build there, with the impression that that was a missing piece of the puzzle, that we should keep the park and use the infrastructure that already exists and create something that had ecological values and added value. So we moved all things around, but I'm not sure I answer to your question, because you're asking how do you start the dialogue upstream, where the prospective meetings and before the study begins. Our team TDK would always send somebody that was responsible for landscape planning, somebody for ecology. We will have an engineer team, and then it depends of the next steps, what is needed, requested, and necessary. But upstream, there are always strategical approaches that will determine everything, and we try to zoom out of what is the neighborhood and what are the strategies that are necessary and useful to have your position within the greater frame and environment. It's a question of the morphology and the topography, and I think this is a dialogue for the competition. So what is in the program, in this one, in your project, in this project here? It's mainly lodging, 1,200, 1,300 lodging, and shops. But we're in a neighborhood with difficulties. On the long term, there's a potential to have more mixity of activities, but we do already have some activities here, professional activities, nearby. But in the perimeter, as we have it, could you say a few more things for the different services? You have a station, you have shops. There's trade, and the train station is always important in the suburbs, because that's where you will usually find some shops. People will stop before going home next to the train station, and I don't have the impression it's immediately next to the train station. Is it because of Natura 2000 area? Because I think this lake is part of this Natura 2000 area, and there were associations that were worrying about how to use these urban areas. So how did you do things? Can you please explain us a few more things about density and intensity of usage compared to this train station? And I do want to say that there is a park that I saw that there's a tramway and there's a white line that shows it's a tram traveling around the perimeter. And we're trying to show the exit of the train station that is in this triangle that's white in the perimeter of the project, and create pedestrian areas that bring you all to the center of the shopping area. So we can see that you can have shops, and we realize there's a diagonal line that links the train station and the lodging area and the activity professional area. You see there's an axis structuring equipment and shops.
But this whole question of programming, we don't know how to run the whole ground floor. So the urban project had to face up to quite a few needs that are contradictory, and to accompany pathways to preserve the Natura 2000 areas, and to build a neighborhood that has a certain level of amenities for the future habitations. But this is already in place. Don't remove the image because I realize that in addition to Saint-Denis, you have the cités-jardins Astin with Saint-Lazare, which gives you a general idea about the scale of your project. Here, in terms of buildings and the urban morphology, this is a collective area, for sure. This is not individual or attached buildings. You can also see the shape of what's being asked of us today. Staines was central. You can see the plan, you can see what the issue is. There's a central place with the main building, and then there are the housing units. And it looks a lot like what we see in most of the city gardens. But in a neighborhood today, we're being asked to be able to drive around in all directions, to go fast, not to have too much hierarchy, because you won't be able to, don't know how to make it pay, where we're afraid there'll be squatters. So there's a kind of a different logic. You have to circulate, and you shouldn't be stopping. And I think this is the kind of plan, it shows that well. It's hard to have a hierarchy, but if you do something that's centered, you're doing urban composition. Just to respond, because we're not in the same drawing here, we didn't call it this. The Zoom is going to be coming. Here you can see the station and the diagonal, and it's true that here you'll see all of the commerces being structured and a part of the equipment, and we call this the active edge of the woods. It's kind of a peaceful area where various usages are found. We try to unroute the routes. We try to combine plantations and pedestrian areas, and there's a school group, which is a bit central. It's kind of a grouping around that. It's kind of the junction between the major park systems and these three neighborhoods. It's not an interurban city. The idea was really to try to gather together different qualities. It is not but it was good to show the city of Staines and the Saint-Lazare area. There's a lot of green around Saint-Lazare. I know it's difficult perhaps to defend, but I like the big areas. The interpreter can't hear what's being said. It's not revolutionary, but it's impossible. It interests absolutely no one. Are there a lot of elected officials relaying these ideas to people that are making decisions? I don't know if it helps that you call it a garden city. Maybe you should try it. Maybe you should call it that. I agree. You can go from a garden city to a bigger center, and there are a lot of qualities that are not observed that should be observed, especially in the use of the land. Obviously, I defend the idea of a prior landscape that you can found the project on, and I think the landscape can be drawn. It's also a question of shape, maybe not exactly in the same way as in architecture, but still, it's a real question in schools these days. We'll take the two last questions, Sebastian, and then my question is for Émilie Rousseau. I see the study that you run on the sustainable neighborhood. Now, about the roundtable, you had an inspiration of what you're presenting where you yourself studied about a sustainable neighborhood. Is it the way it was initially planned, or what inspired these new? So how do you assess this in sustainable neighborhoods and what remains, what is it becoming, and so forth. I've talked a little bit, but I can also cite other things. The analysis that we made was not necessarily to compare to city gardens at the beginning. 5 or 10 years ago, when sustainable neighborhoods started to come out of the ecological areas, we started to see whether or not they were similar. But here, for today, we took a look at all of these neighborhoods that we had referenced in the Paris area, and there's a lot of similarities. Now, the similarities we found in functional mixity and social mixity, and automatically, very often, there was social housing in these areas. And now in the functional mixture, it was of great importance. You couldn't have a mixed area for small projects. We often have businesses and other types of activities. So there's some similarity there with garden cities, and also the actual location of these sites. These would be in sites that are near the city, and the garden city were linked to the BHM. But in terms of the sustainable neighborhoods, real estate is often real estate that we want to work on. They may be abandoned industrial sites often, and so we're in sectors that are quite urban and not very far. We don't have that many more in the Grand Couronne, and we also have many other things of a natural basis. These are projects that we have in most of these sustainable neighborhoods, and the importance of the green areas, it's the importance of having a hierarchy between these different spaces, but it's also true that we go beyond. Nature today is a luxury, and we try now, with respect to the ecological things at stake, to maintain, insofar as possible, and with the importance of central areas. And there are things in this century which are not the same. The sustainable neighborhood will go further in our thought process because we're thinking about waste management, about energy strategies for buildings. We're going to be having mobility as well, which is quite different, even though the sustainable neighborhood before the automobile, and we're almost after the automobile, and we try to give importance to everything having to do with public transport. But we realize that there are many things, even in portage of operations. There's some of our operations that are paid by public funds and debt and government aid. There's a lot of similarities, and it's true that we draw conclusions today based on sustainable quarters. What similarities are? Well, there are quite a few similarities, in fact. I found these presentations interesting. There was one point that was kind of implicit in everything we heard. It was the question of climate. And with our founding fathers, there were things that were said about the climate. I was asking myself the question, listening to you, is to what extent is the idea of the Garden Cities model, I know it's quite broad, but can this also provide a better comfort faced with climate change, whether it be at all scales, whether it be regional or in the habitat or various elements? So in what way, and how do we think about this from the point of view of climate? And this might make it possible to respond to additional issues in terms of composition. It's another way of thinking about form in all scales. It also leads one to think about landscape and plantations, and how do you shield ourselves from the sun and the wind and so forth. So these are things that came to mind. I wonder if you have any time to respond on those questions. I'd be happy to respond quickly. Thank you for this question, which in my way of thinking is going to be increasingly important in the coming years. I think that the city gardens, garden cities, are ecologically unsuspectingly important. The idea is locating housing near public transport, and garden cities make it possible to do that. The second point is that the landscaping and the form of that landscaping, when you look at the pictures of the Guillemelt in the Green Belt in Maryland, which is an example of garden cities, when you look at Châtenay-Malabry, all of the non-built spaces are, in fact, we talked about renaturation. It helps to fight against the effect of heat. And we see what's going on in Paris, where we keep covering things with tar. Here we can at last show and think about the question of density. A city that's not dense enough is a problem because you take your individual vehicle to go to the equipment. But if it's too dense, you're creating hotspots that's just, you can't put up with the heat. In a very dense cities and a very densely occupied city give rise to a phenomenon we call metropolization, which is linked to the increase in real estate prices. Since you're concentrating a lot of equipment in a small place, people that go to work or trying to have fun have to live far away. So with the metropolization, we're concentrating activities in an urban center and causing other people to live further away. So there's a peri-urbanization which is uncontrolled. So you can live nearby. For all of those reasons, garden cities are an ecological model which, in my opinion, is a model for the future. Indeed, it's a good balance, and it's one of the best balances that industrial prosperity has brought us. Now, perhaps we went a bit too far. I think there's a lot of parameters to be introduced. Garden cities have to be thought out because there were horses at the time. Garden cities were born at a time when horses started disappearing from cities to replace little by cars. But if we replace cars by horses, the city will resemble something totally different. And there'll be other inhabitants in the city, and those are the ones that we would be seeking to bring back. In other words, if you build housing, you build housing for humans. We're also building it for plants and insects and animals and so forth. And this is kind of the root of the problem of super urban renewal. You're exporting comfort to the country by founding this on a dichotomy, which is comfort, which is totally fabricated of the project within the house, which is almost a bubble of comfort, where you regulate tons of things. Everything is artificial. And then outside, you have the garden, which has become and is a pleasure garden. So there's a big dichotomy, which is more and more installed. And a city garden, there's the word garden, but it's a vegetable garden to a great extent. There was some landscaping, but there was a lot of vegetable gardens in many areas, because the idea was also that you could produce a part of what you eat in your garden. There are garden cities where you don't have access from the home to the garden. You had to walk around, because it wasn't for your pleasure. It was to grow some food, which was used only for that, for production. So this idea is also based on what's being requested increasingly today, and what we're perhaps together manufacturing, was to call into question the whole idea of comfort, and to maybe replace that, maybe it's not the right word, but by well-being. Comfort, for me, is something that you imagine is produced by industry, transforming a lot to make it comfortable, whereas well-being calls upon an exchange with the elements from the medium. You know, if it's in a bubble, in a house or in this room or in a house where you're too hot, in fact, So how do we do this before? Either we didn't close it, or we didn't ventilate as much, or we got too hot. But it's kind of the question you have to ask about everything we've manufactured. The energy limit is going to make it such that we have to review our notion of comfort, and maybe we should talk about well-being. Maybe we should all do something else. So that means we need to change with the times. And in garden cities, the purpose is not the same, means of transport is not the same. We need to get rid of all of these parameters that we've forgotten and that contributed to it being a whole project, whether it be public transport or whatever. I'd like to react to the idea of a garden. The garden in a garden city is kind of domesticated. It's a human thing for humans to feed them or for their pleasure or recreation. But in modern urbanism, that's all it is. And so maybe the site, because of the Natura 2000, requires us to think of a garden as being inaccessible. In many areas would be for the fauna and the flora. They would be the ones that are living in that garden city. But is it not too much? Because there's a whole lot of shocks that are being subjected to. Should we not get the door further away from the street? A lot of there's a kind of a pocket which was preserved, and so it's not a place maybe where you're going to feel safe when you go from one neighborhood to another. But the advantage of applying regulations at the heart of the project, animals and plants and so forth, I think there are lots of facets, and the question of climate is linked to the question of soil and the earth. So the regulatory obligation to protect certain species requires a different form, and it's maybe not that comfortable as all of that compared to standards and safety. I'm thinking, in the second crown, the second ring road around Paris, it's not a dense city. It's not as dense as. What last question? We're going to have to take this last question, and then we can talk informally afterwards. I'll be brief. It's not even a question. 2 invitations that I'd like to throw out there. I don't have the program. I hope that I'd like to invite you to the School of Grenoble. I really enjoyed the way you explain your meeting with the garden cities and the way in which you show that you do research in your own way. So you're definitely welcome to talk with our student. And since I'd like to finish on something, since architecture schools, I wanted to launch an invitation to Mr. Bianco, to come to reassure in our workshops our students who are still drawing, and as picturesque as possible. So I think maybe to exchange more extensively about the perspective of urbanism in garden cities that I have some differences with. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers for having been so kind as to come and to respond to all of these questions and to leave us with hope that life carries on. There's no problem there, and that very certainly there will be projects with a lot of attention being paid. I don't know if there are garden cities, but there are architectural and urban projects with a lot of attention and a lot of heart and a lot of skill, but which take into account the various constraints that are involved in these times. We're going to finish now with our 2 main witnesses. I'd like for Benoit to join me. My rule will be modest. It's really just to say that Isabelle Grone has left and Maria Castillo-Ramon, who are both our witnesses for a conclusion, and as well all members of the scientific committee of our international colloquium who are involved in our work and have been for the last 2 years. And I would like to have a conclusion with 2 voices. Well, sit down, please. Isabelle is going to be here in just a moment. She was already preparing for this. I think she knows she's being called. Isabelle, if you could join us. And I'm going to bring you some water. We will be brief. First of all, I would like to thank Noémie and Morangan and Medera Crespo, who did a wonderful and remarkable job. Yes, yes indeed. They're extremely effective. I've never seen something be prepared so quickly. I'd also like to thank Benoit, who was a wonderful contact here. Very useful and efficient and pleasant. Thank you so much. And for many other people that we would need to thank. It's very important. Now, I'd like to talk with you a bit because I have 2 hats that I'm wearing. The hat of an architect and a historian, and a so-called, in quotes, an inhabitant who's committed, in very flattering terms, because I live in a garden city in the U.S., where I am a guide for groups, and I'm also on the Urban Consulting Committee, which is a city which is grafted on to a historical area of the Green City, and which have a certain number of difficulties. And the town is a small department of urbanism that we have, is located where a group of concerned citizens that we talk a lot with promoters and so forth. It's really interesting, and sometimes it's a bit difficult. So,
this seminar was extremely rich and interesting. We had a nice presentation, and I appreciated the enthusiasm of presentations, and the fact as well that many presentations would show projects that has been done by teams, by several disciplines. It was not an egoistic work made by a single person, but it was a holistic approach with very interesting aspects. I do see a question that worries me, because we mentioned a couple of times management of archives. Of course, you have public archives that are generally well maintained and preserved, but there are also questions of organizing in cooperatives, and sometimes documents are in boxes. Nobody knows exactly what to do with these boxes. And these archives can be useful. They could be of many different importance, but they merit to be treated in a correct way. So we had interventions and presentations either by single people or by neighbors. We also had the mayor of Detroit that came here yesterday, that was convinced of the extraordinary work that has been done in the city of Rouen. It was a remarkable work, and I appreciated a lot the fact that people living in Suresnes would come and give us some information of their experience life conditions, worries that they have for the daily life. We also had architects like Nord-Pas-de-Calais. I'm originally from Nord-Pas-de-Calais myself, actually, and we had great questions that demonstrated that the colloquium was not just an abstract idea, but the symposium would speak about things that would influence our lives. Oh, this is great. But did you read this book? I think it's worth reading this book because it's an additional print. We had interventions that were not presented. There were some speakers that did not show up. I read many parts of the text, and I do believe, honestly, that the articles of Chemin Vert is very interesting. It's the green lane that has influenced Stans and other cities, even if they had problems to overcome. Châtelet-Malabry is a very important project as well, and there's another article for Châtelet-Malabry that you might have heard about when we went for a walk yesterday, because things are still ongoing for Châtelet-Malabry. Another article that was not presented was Valentin Bourdon speaking about the commons, and it was a very interesting article as well. So let me say a few other points that I would like to insist and remind you. The notion of a spirit of place, or the understanding of tides, spirit of having an environmental and social understanding of the soul of the place, and it is a material and immaterial dimension. Two subjects that I think are linked with it is public health, that was extremely important, especially the few years, and the cités-jardins especially gives equipment for a health unit that has disappeared during the decades, and I wonder if we should not have again public health infrastructure. Eric Ambert talked about well-being, and I would add a comfort, and not only well-being, because I believe these two concepts are more interesting. Well-being is also the question of energy inefficiency, that the insecurity and poverty of energy efficiency in old buildings is a subject that concerns many people living in traditional city gardens. These are important subjects. The second pillar would be the reality on site. And I think it's important for certain students from architecture visit and try to understand what is urban planning. And it's not only green lines or alleys, topography, pathways, and all these elements you can see being developed. It's not a static thing, but it's in evolution. And there were some extraordinary city gardens that I've seen evolving through decades. And I was very happy to read this book during the COVID lockdown period. The reality of the territories is the densification in a soft way. It's not excessive. You have a possibility in many cases of adding densification in the living area, and I think about Delivrance as well, where you have the notion of getting some homes added, find places for parking lots, and discover how to augment your little garden, even if it's an intermediate lodging. You find quality, but in America we speak a lot of missing middle, and it's a subject that's very important to have something that has an advantage on social, urbanistic, and environmental dimension. The third pillar is opening to the outside world. City gardens is a unity, but they don't exist alone in the planet. The other things around the city gardens, and we have a good relationship with the neighbors and have links, attract people living there that enjoy their well-being in their city garden, have a good exchange with the visitors, and be able to open physically, socially to the outside world. The last pillar is the subject that I have described, what I call the international dimension of the city gardens. The fact that we have mentioned this question here, we have case studies of many different countries, Poland, Lithuania, Australia, and we can indeed englobe much more in our city gardens. And the history will be never completed. Howard went to America before writing his books. He visited Riverside and Olmsted, and there is a dimension of landscape. If you go, because Parker made constructions in Brasilia, and these ideas have been exported. The role of Darwin is well known. And Smile worked together and went to the United States. But there are things we know less, that in Americas there were several war cities, 1917, 1918, that are great examples of little city gardens, and they could be compared with the Trent ones. Exchange, of course, that's what we're doing here today, but I believe it's a great conference of 1925 in New York, 1931 in Berlin, and there were city gardens and lodgings that have been presented and rehabilitated so that we know how these different projects are. Green Belt is well known as well since 1937. It's all parts of a link and of a chain, different links. Cohen reminded me of a Soviet newspaper of 1945, and Greenwald was the cover page. All this exchange and knowledge going much farther of what we see in our daily life. So the dialogue between the countries continues, and ecological dimension is also very trendy. We had lots of information, not of ideas. We apprehend our hopes and our worries, and we could talk about all these things in a very pragmatic way. So I do hope indeed that we will be able to continue to exchange information with the different networks of cités-jardins Île-de-France and have larger networks. Not everybody will exchange, but we are enough people here to be able to say that the aim of this conference will be put into perspective and dimension of a common heritage resulting from the concept of the gardens of the city developed by Howard last century, and altogether we're stronger than individual projects. Thank you very much.
Bonsoir déjà. Bonsoir. C'est pas encore. Oh non, pas encore. Bon, je vais essayer de regrouper.
I will summarize 2 minutes. So many people spoke, we talked about so many things, and we had the advantage of a social dimension and a dimension of the vegetal world that was mentioned many times. So, on the social dimension, I will repeat that we mentioned many times the importance of the social dimension. I reminded that Mr. Dawi that made the opening, and he reminded us that there was a question of the role of the people living here, and the social role is important with examples, and we heard of cultural rights. It touched me a lot to talk about right of inhabitants. We heard of social cohesion, and several people mentioned the logis floral, national identity of Czech Republic, cooperatives of cités-jardins, and above all, we had lots of material to talk about the motivation of people living in our districts and how to recognize and have the heritage value being augmented. Valuing where you live is important. That was example of Poland, but we've seen that as well in other areas, in other countries where the knowledge of people, especially where they do not know their cultural heritage, it's getting an element of poverty, like in Bucharest. This evolution of the bylaws and of the way of these inhabitants, we realized that there were many realizations for Vrije city that we could explain the changes of the social dimension of inhabitants, but as well the very old examples of gentrification in Hampstead and in other suburbs. And we have the election of the lodging, that you own it because of different kinds of organization of logis familial, and the challenges of this composition. Social diversity was very important in Cité Plaza in Rosambela, that still has constraints for minor cities for the region of Lille that can be linked as challenges for the integration of the inhabitants, as it has been said by Lara, the integration by work and rehabilitation of the buildings and of the neighborhoods. There are also questions about subject with a social future and social cohesion. And these are expectations that are very much linked to sociological changes.
Garden cities continue to be social housing, but here we talked about the idea of threat, the threat of sale and transformation, or also there's also a threat of gentrification, I'd like to say, of expulsion, to be clear. Because that's, I didn't want to talk about gentrification, but I'm sure he'll accept the term expulsion of inhabitants. And these are people with low levels of revenue. We also talked about the robustness of garden cities with respect to other solutions. And I think it's very good to talk about robustness with respect to the framework. I'd like to recommend the book to you because not everybody had the opportunity of listening to all of the authors. But the Habitu read symbolizes very well the threat, the valuation of a real estate nature, and also the fight of inhabitants who find in the patrimonialization a tool for resistance. And this should draw attention for us, we who are in the academic circles and so forth. From the plant side and the landscape side, which is a value that's broadly recognized, and there's no problem there, this sends us back to very contemporary problems: the naturalization of cities, the climate crisis, decarbonation, biodiversity, and I would add green infrastructures, which nobody spoke about here, but we could certainly do that, and bioclimatism of public areas. So the Logis Royal was an example here, and the cases that we saw in Tours. And I'm going to stop here because I think we had some interesting interventions from Francesca De Pietro, who raised the question of the place not only of inhabitants but of vegetation. And she said that in her opinion, we have a real need to renew vegetable or plantations. And a reminder was given as well, a kind of as a provocation, that garden cities were a scale, she said, to keep nature in the city. But I don't think we should stop there. We need to extend this process of thought beyond to a bigger scale. And in this question of the biggest possible scale, thankfully this afternoon we came across the question of the territorial or regional scale, which had almost disappeared until today. And this regional scale, we're including this in the reflection we had right up until now. It's true that it was implicit. We saw the garden city in the greater Paris area, which part of a system, but we perceived this as a system of Rio Tinto in Spain. We also saw several cases in Lithuania, for example, where the garden cities formed a whole ensemble on the regional scale. But perhaps the moment in which a real question was raised all by itself, it was in the afternoon when we saw there was a possibility of seeing the principle of garden cities as a more contemporary issue, whether it be the process that continues, as we talked about this afternoon, the model for peri-urban species around the Paris area. So all of these types of questions we talked about this afternoon come back to the question that was floating during the whole symposium. Are garden cities, could they be an inspiration for the city of the future? Can garden cities be an inspiration? And I recommend that you read the book, and you'll see in there are positions that are contrary. There are affirmations. Robert Frisson says that there is no model. In even a historical model, there's nothing to do with the contemporary period. But perhaps we've seen several communications which derived that possibility of projecting several principles into the contemporary world. At the same time, we saw, in a certain sense, that the city of tomorrow is already built. even in garden cities that we saw here. So the idea that we could use the same principles, but we need to consider in a certain way the city of the future will be the current urban region, but we need to continue to think about it. And this sends us back to the whole question that we've been dealing with in the university circles, but I think sometimes we need to think about to go towards health, to go towards the well-being and reality if possible, where we're trying to get closer to something that's positive in the future. For me, it was extremely enriching, and I loved it. To be part of this symposium. And I hope, we talk about hope, that academics will deal with people involved in the field and try to find a way forward. And I think that really we need to go more deeply into this type of approach, and I think that it's a wonderful help, and it has been a help. It's a collective work together on the part of the public authorities and all of those who have spoken. And I also like to conclude, because I think that all of us would like to thank the effort that was made by the organization, not only those who published the book, such as Isabelle Gournay, who just said a few minutes ago, but those that organized the meeting. It was so well organized. And specifically, I would also like to thank the Regional Association of the Architects of the Greater Paris area, and the team with Noemi and others. I imagine that they're still here, so a round of applause for them. I also would like to thank a few people, to say that this work and this colloquium and all of the thanks that have been expressed, it's a work of more than 10 years, in fact, in the association, first of all in a formal group and subsequently a structure into an association. The fact that we group together inhabitants and communities and investors and institutions. So there we are. This is the work that was just done. And with this work, the publication and the exchanges we've had, and the perspectives we have identified, and I'd like obviously to thank the association, the board of directors, and all of those who are here present and working for the association, and for a few who participated and spoke, and to the people that have attended. I'm going to talk to you about a few practical details. I'd like for you to hand back your headsets for the translation. We cannot have any losses. If you've left them on the chair, please pick them up and bring them back. This colloquium, it was on YouTube, and you can see it, and you can review it and see it again. On YouTube, you can have all of both days. You also have a program that was on the Channel 3 in France about the colloquium, and you can continue to follow current events, regional current events, via our newsletter and the internet site, about new perspectives that we will certainly be bringing to your attention during 2023. Thank you. Have a good trip home.
Les interprètes vous remercient également.